Autumn evening, decades after the Second World War had ended. A family gathers in a dim attic, the smell of dust and wood mixing with the sharp chill of forgotten time. Beneath a rusted trunk, wrapped in twine, lies a bundle of paper yellowed with age. When the string is cut, the first page trembles in the reader's hand. The ink has faded, yet the voice is unmistakable. My dearest, I don't know if I'll survive tomorrow. It is the last trace of a soldier who never returned, a letter written in hope, but never received. Scenes like this have unfolded across the globe. Letters delayed by chaos, misplaced in depots, sunk in mail ships, or trapped in collapsed buildings, surface decades later, long after the war that silenced them. They do not recount battles or victories, but the fragile voices of love, fear, and longing that war tried to erase. And when they are finally read, they change the memory of families forever. When bombs fell on European cities, they destroyed not only homes and lives, but also the intimate threads that connected families. Letters. Entire post offices collapsed under fire, leaving behind charred piles of correspondence that would never reach their destinations. Among the rubble of Hamburg, London, and Warsaw, rescuers occasionally found bags of scorched envelopes. Many were beyond recognition, but some survived just enough for words to be read decades later, discovered during reconstruction or by chance in archives. One such discovery occurred in Dresden, where workers clearing debris in the post-war years uncovered a metal box filled with letters written by German soldiers on the Eastern Front. They had been awaiting dispatch in the city's central post office when the firestorm of February burned the building to ash. Hidden in the collapsed cellar, the letters remained untouched until construction workers found them in the 1960s. Families were contacted whenever possible, and for many, it was the first time they heard the voices of fathers, brothers, or sons long dead. The emotions these belated deliveries caused were often overwhelming. Imagine a widow who had mourned for 2 decades, suddenly holding the last words her husband had ever written. The grief returned, but so too did a sense of connection, a bridge across time that gave meaning to the silence. These letters were no longer simply messages. They became sacred relics, proof of lives cut short, but never forgotten. Across Europe, museums began collecting similar finds. The Imperial War Museum in London preserves fragments of correspondence, singed by fire during the Blitz. The German Historical Museum keeps envelopes stained with water and soot, their stamps half-burned. Each one is displayed not as an artifact of war strategy, but as testimony of ordinary lives interrupted. These voices from the ashes remind us that war seeks to erase individuality, reducing human beings to numbers and statistics. Yet the letters defy that erasure. They carry the smell of smoke, the marks of trembling hands, the unfinished sentences of those who believed their words might reach home. Even delayed for decades, they speak with urgency, demanding to be heard. And so the story of lost wartime letters begins not with delivery, but with absence, an absence that lasted for years, even generations, until the ashes themselves gave them back. During the war, the simple act of waiting for the post became both a ritual and a torment. Families gathered around kitchen tables, watching for the local postman, whose bicycle bell or footsteps on gravel carried more weight than official communiques. A letter could mean reassurance that a loved one was alive, even if only for another day. But when weeks passed with no delivery, silence became its own kind of message. The postal systems of every warring nation were stretched beyond their limits. Censorship offices intercepted countless letters, sometimes delaying them for months. Bombings destroyed sorting centers. Trains carrying sacks of correspondence were diverted to urgent military cargo, leaving bags of letters abandoned in depots. And every time a ship carrying overseas mail was sunk, thousands of words were swallowed by the sea. Families often never knew why their loved one's letter never came. They only felt the absence, as if it were a wound. In Britain, the General Post Office recorded entire convoys of mail lost to U-boats in the Atlantic. In the United States, sacks bound for troops in Europe or North Africa sometimes vanished with torpedoed Liberty ships. In the Soviet Union, soldiers' letters often disappeared, not only through battlefield chaos, but also through the hand of censors, who confiscated anything that hinted at defeatism. For families, the silence was indistinguishable, whether their soldier had died or whether the letter had simply been lost. They endured the same uncertainty. Historians now know that millions of letters, written during the war, never reached their destinations. Some are still hidden in archives, stored in military warehouses, or captured as enemy documents. Others were burned or buried, leaving only the faint memory that they once existed. The pain of the mail that never came defined the wartime experience of countless mothers, wives, and children, who sat at tables, staring at empty places where words should have been. These letters remind us that war was not only about battles lost and won, but also about connections severed. For every missive that arrived safely, hundreds never did. The silence they left behind became a universal battlefield of waiting, where families fought against doubt, fear, and grief with nothing but hope to sustain them. Of all the places where wartime letters vanished, the sea was the most merciless. Convoys crossing the Atlantic or Arctic carried not just tanks and ammunition, but also thousands of bags of mail. When ships sank, entire communities of voices went with them, lost in seconds to icy depths. The ocean floor became a grave not only for sailors, but also for countless unwritten goodbyes, confessions, and declarations of love. One tragic example occurred in the sinking of the SS Jonathan Holt, a British merchant ship torpedoed in 1941 while carrying military mail. Survivors later recalled watching sacks of letters float briefly among the wreckage before disappearing beneath the waves. For those who waited in towns and villages back home, the silence stretched for months. Only later did official notices explain that the mail had been lost at sea, leaving families to imagine the words they would never read. In the Arctic convoys to Murmansk, the same tragedy unfolded in frozen form. When ships like the HMS Edinburgh went down, they took with them not just gold and supplies, but also entire cargoes of correspondence. Sailors often wrote letters just before sailing, knowing that once the convoy departed, they might never return. Many of those letters never left the mailroom before sinking, still sealed in bags that now rest in the cold darkness of the Barents Sea. Occasionally, fragments surfaced. Fishermen sometimes hauled in half-decayed envelopes caught in their nets, the ink blurred but still revealing a name, a place, or a few final words. These rare recoveries carried immense symbolic weight, as if the sea itself, after decades, had chosen to give back a fragment of memory. Today, maritime museums in Britain, Canada, and Russia preserve a handful of such letters, salvaged from wrecks. Each one represents not just a personal story, but an entire generation's fragile line of communication. To read them is to feel the distance, the fear, and the hope that once crossed oceans only to vanish beneath them. The sea claimed thousands of ships during the war, but among its quietest victims were the letters that never reached the hands waiting for them. Their loss added another layer of grief, invisible but enduring, as families lived with words forever lost to the tides. In cities devastated by air raids, letters often lay entombed beneath the ruins. Postal stations, apartment buildings, and military headquarters were reduced to rubble in minutes, sealing thousands of envelopes within collapsed walls. For decades, these paper fragments remained hidden, only to be discovered during reconstruction long after the war had ended. Each discovery carried the power of reopening wounds, while simultaneously offering closure. One of the most striking cases emerged in Warsaw during post-war rebuilding. Workers clearing a bombed neighborhood in the late 1940s uncovered a metal container filled with correspondence addressed to families across Poland. The letters had been written by soldiers trapped in the Warsaw Ghetto and by underground fighters resisting occupation. Many messages bore hastily written words of farewell, aware that they might be the last communication with loved ones. Families who received them years later described the experience as both devastating and comforting. Devastating, because it confirmed losses. Comforting because it preserved voices once thought erased. Berlin offered another example. In the 1970s, a demolition team, preparing to clear an old warehouse, discovered sacks of letters dated from the final months of the war. Most had never been distributed because the city collapsed before they could be sorted. When historians examined them, they found a mixture of hope and despair. One young soldier wrote confidently of Germany's eventual victory, while another admitted to his wife that he no longer believed in survival. These contradictory voices, hidden for decades, revealed the raw uncertainty of lives caught in history's collapse. Such discoveries reminded post-war societies of the fragile humanity buried beneath rubble. Letters carried not propaganda, but personal truths, moments of tenderness, longing, or resignation. They gave modern readers a window into emotions that official histories rarely capture. For archaeologists and historians, these letters became invaluable primary sources, fragile relics of lived experience rather than statistics or political rhetoric. For families, the impact was immeasurable. Receiving a letter decades later could change the way they remembered a parent or sibling. Instead of silence, there was now a testimony sometimes of love, sometimes of fear, but always of presence. The rubble had preserved what war had tried to destroy: the human voice. Buried letters remind us that history is not only written in monuments or archives. Sometimes, it sleeps beneath collapsed walls, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to listen to voices from the dust. Every nation in the war employed censorship, but the practice often meant that letters never arrived at all. Military authorities intercepted correspondence that revealed too much about troop movements, shortages, or morale. In many cases, entire bags of mail were destroyed, simply because they contained material deemed dangerous. For families, this meant that silence was not always caused by enemy action, but by their own governments. In Nazi Germany, soldiers' letters passed through strict scrutiny. Anything suggesting doubt about victory, criticism of leadership, or sympathy for enemies was confiscated. Many soldiers learned to self-censor, filling their letters with mundane details rather than honest fears. Yet even neutral messages sometimes vanished. Intercepted letters were rarely returned to families. They disappeared into bureaucratic archives or fires. Only decades later did some surface in captured German records, now housed in institutions like the Bundesarchiv. The Soviet Union operated an equally harsh system. Letters were opened, read, and sometimes rewritten before being allowed to pass. Phrases describing hunger, exhaustion, or lack of supplies were often cut, leaving families with fragmented notes. In some cases, entire bundles were withheld to prevent the spread of defeatist sentiment. For those waiting at home, The result was the same as destruction: long silences that bred fear and uncertainty. The Allies also engaged in censorship, though often less severe. In Britain, envelopes arrived with blacked-out sections, entire sentences reduced to inked rectangles. In the United States, military censors reviewed mail from overseas bases. If letters contained sensitive details about operations, they were destroyed entirely. Sailors and soldiers adapted by writing in vague metaphors or codes that only their families would understand. Still, countless messages vanished, leaving behind only questions. These censored silences demonstrate how war extended beyond battlefields into the most private spaces. A soldier's attempt to reassure his family or confess his fears could vanish not because of enemy fire, but because of officials with stamps and scissors. For historians, the rediscovery of confiscated letters in archives, decades later, reveals not only personal truths, but also the mechanisms of control that shaped wartime societies. Censorship stole voices, yet paradoxically, it preserved them. Hidden away in government files, many letters survive to be read by later generations. They testify not only to the experiences of those who wrote them, but also to the invisible hand of power that decided which words were safe to share, and which would be silenced forever. The ocean claimed more letters than any censor or archivist. Ships carrying mail across the Atlantic or the Pacific often doubled as lifelines of communication between soldiers and their families. When those ships went down under torpedoes, bombs, or storms, thousands of personal messages vanished into the deep. For the loved ones waiting at home, the silence that followed felt like abandonment, when in truth, it was the sea that had swallowed their words. One infamous example was the sinking of the troop ship, carrying both soldiers and massive sacks of correspondence. Survivors later recalled watching the mailbags float briefly before vanishing into flames and waves. Among them were farewell notes, birthday greetings, and reassurances that never reached their intended readers. To families, the loss seemed random and cruel, proof that war consumed not only lives but also voices. Naval records from the Battle of the Atlantic reveal how entire convoys carried thousands of letters at a time. Submarine attacks didn't just deprive nations of supplies, they cut communication lines between soldiers and civilians. Letters describing conditions at the front, plans for the future, or tender confessions disappeared without a trace. For those who had written them, it meant their last thoughts would never be known. Years later, divers exploring shipwrecks occasionally recovered waterproof containers with intact envelopes. Though most were too damaged to read, a few survived well enough to reveal fragments of handwriting, faded ink still speaking across time. Such discoveries sparked both excitement and sorrow, as they confirmed how much human testimony lay buried in the seabed. For historians, letters lost at sea remind us that communication during the war was fragile, constantly at the mercy of forces beyond human control. They also highlight the unseen cost of naval battles, not only cargo and soldiers, but the silenced words of entire communities. The sea did not care about rank, ideology, or hope. It swallowed the voices of generals and privates, mothers and sweethearts alike. What remains today are only fragments. Yet even those fragments speak of longing carried on fragile paper, now resting beneath the waves. Not all lost letters traveled oceans or battlefields. Many remained hidden in ordinary places, attics, trunks, or closets, where they lay forgotten for decades. Sometimes they were deliberately concealed by relatives unable to confront painful memories. In other cases, they were misplaced during moves or estate sales, surfacing only when new generations explored old boxes. One remarkable case occurred in a farmhouse in rural France, where a family discovered bundles of wartime letters sealed in a wooden chest beneath blankets. They had been written by a captured soldier held in Germany, each one carefully tied with string. For reasons unknown, his wife never opened them, perhaps unable to bear the possibility of false hope. When their grandchildren found them, half a century later, they read words untouched since the day they were written. In the United States, estate sales have occasionally yielded wartime correspondence, tucked into furniture or trunks. Buyers, realizing their significance, often sought to return them to surviving relatives. These reunions carried powerful emotions. Families received not only messages from the past, but also tangible proof that their ancestors had tried to reach them, even if fate had intervened. Historians value attic discoveries because they often include letters that escaped censorship. Unlike official archives, these personal collections capture unfiltered emotions: fear, doubt, love, or anger expressed without fear of deletion. They provide a raw glimpse into the psychology of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. For families, however, such finds can be double-edged. Joy at recovering the voice of a long-lost relative is tempered by grief that the words lay unread for so long. Each envelope becomes both a gift and a reminder of absence. Hidden letters demonstrate how war continues to unfold across generations. What one family cannot bear to confront, another may rediscover decades later, finding new meaning in fragile pages that waited silently in attics for the right hands to open them. On the battlefront, letters were sometimes written in the very moments between bombardments. Soldiers crouched in trenches or foxholes scribbled words with trembling hands, knowing any shell might silence them forever. Many of these notes never left the front. Carried in breast pockets, helmets, or knapsacks, they were often buried with the men who wrote them. Battlefield recoveries after major offensives frequently uncovered letters still tucked into uniforms. Some were opened by comrades who hoped to deliver them, others passed to military authorities. Yet countless more were lost in mud, fire, or retreat. For historians, these fragments hold a raw intimacy unmatched by later recollections. They capture emotions still burning in the moment, without the filter of hindsight. In France's Ardennes forests, search teams decades later found notebooks waterlogged but legible, containing last words to mothers, wives, and unborn children. The handwriting, blurred by snow and rain, revealed not only personal grief but also resilience. Some urged families not to despair, others confessed fears never voiced aloud. These pages were not official dispatches, but deeply human echoes preserved by chance. For the men who carried them, the act of writing often mattered as much as delivery. Putting words on paper gave form to hope, provided an anchor against chaos. Even if the letter never arrived, the gesture itself connected soldier to home, if only in imagination. Families who eventually received such battlefield letters decades later experienced a peculiar blend of grief and closure. To read words written hours before death was painful, yet it affirmed that love and memory had survived longer than war itself. Every torn scrap of paper, each sentence cut short by gunfire, stands as testimony. During the war, censorship shadowed every letter. Military authorities demanded that soldiers avoid details that might betray positions or weaken morale. Phrases deemed dangerous were cut out with razors, blacked with ink, or replaced by printed warnings. Families often received envelopes riddled with holes where words had once been, a visual reminder that truth had been sacrificed to security. Censors worked tirelessly in offices near ports and bases, examining thousands of letters daily. They cut away references to units, names of commanders, or descriptions of equipment. But they also excised confessions of despair, complaints about rations, or doubts about victory. Silence was safer than honesty. This censorship left scars on families. Mothers holding letters full of missing words wondered what their sons had tried to say. Sweethearts reading sentences, broken mid-thought, imagined heartbreaks that were never explained. The gaps became as loud as the words themselves, creating mysteries that could never be resolved. Decades later, uncensored drafts sometimes surfaced notes soldiers kept for themselves before rewriting them to pass the censor. These revealed entire emotional worlds, absent from the official record. Fear, exhaustion, even criticism of superiors' expressions that could never travel openly, appeared unfiltered in these hidden versions. Historians studying censored letters emphasize how war policed not only bodies, but also emotions. Even in private words, control reached across oceans. Yet the very act of cutting words out also preserved their absence, reminding us of what people longed to say but were forbidden to share. The censored letter stands as a paradox. It is both communication and silence, proof of presence yet reminder of absence. Families clutched them anyway, because even incomplete, they carried the ink of someone they loved. Among the most heartbreaking artifacts of the war were the envelopes that made the journey home, not to deliver comfort, but to reopen wounds. Many letters bore a cruel stamp, undeliverable, or returned to sender. The intended recipient was no longer alive, no longer at that address, or had vanished in the chaos of displacement. Families who had prayed for words of love instead received a paper reminder of loss. Postal clerks often faced the grim duty of redirecting these letters. Some were returned with military notices. Others carried the handwriting of officers, explaining that the soldier had fallen in battle. The envelopes themselves became symbols of absence, heavy with the silence of what could never be answered. There are cases recorded in Britain and the United States where mothers kept stacks of returned mail in boxes, never opening them again. The sealed envelopes became private memorials, too painful to revisit, yet impossible to discard. For some, they were the only physical trace of a child or husband lost forever. Decades later, archivists and historians uncovered bundles of such letters in post office basements and abandoned depots. They carried the final attempts of soldiers and civilians to bridge the gap of war, returned unopened, their words frozen in time. These silent returns remind us that not every message was lost at sea or destroyed in battle. Some made the full circle, traveling thousands of miles, only to arrive at doors where no one remained to read them. They testify not only to the persistence of love, but also to the cruel efficiency with which war erases the people meant to receive it. Letters were not always written in the safety of barracks or homes. Many were born in mud, under shell fire, or in the fleeting moments of calm between attacks. Soldiers wrote on scraps of ration paper, on the back of maps, or even on pieces of cardboard torn from supply boxes. The texture of these letters still carries the story of where they were composed. Some preserved letters show smudges of rain, stains of earth, or burns from stray embers. In one instance, a French soldier's note home was found decades later with a faint trace of blood, its last line unfinished mid-sentence. These marks are not embellishments. They are physical imprints of the battlefield on paper. In the Russian front, winter forced men to use pencils that would not freeze, their shaky handwriting reflecting the tremors of frostbitten fingers. In the deserts of North Africa, Soldiers folded letters, still gritty with sand, the grains pressed forever into the paper fibers. Each environment left its signature, making every letter a unique relic of survival. Censors sometimes commented on the condition of these messages. Reports describe letters arriving torn, singed, or barely legible, yet still passed through because they held vital emotional weight. Families who received them often kept them untouched, preserving every imperfection as part of the memory. When these battlefield letters surface today, archivists treat them like artifacts. The words tell one story, but the stains, the handwriting, and the fragility of the paper tell another. That communication itself was an act of defiance against destruction. Ink, even when blurred, proved stronger than silence. Inside prisoner of war camps scattered across Europe, Africa, and Asia, letters became lifelines. Regulations under the Geneva Convention allowed captives to send limited correspondence, but the reality varied from camp to camp. A single postcard, no more than a few lines, could mean the difference between despair and endurance. British prisoners in German stalags wrote on standardized forms, forced to choose their words carefully under the watchful eyes of censors. "I am well, and hope you are safe," became the most repeated phrases, stripped of detail but charged with hidden meaning. Families at home learned to read between the lines, searching for clues about health and spirit in every stroke of ink. In the Pacific, Allied captives in Japanese camps often had even fewer opportunities. Some letters were delayed for months or never sent at all. Survivors later recalled composing entire messages in their minds, rehearsing words they never got to write, clinging to imagined conversations as if they were real. Occasionally, smuggled letters broke the silence. In Italy, local civilians risked their lives carrying scraps of paper for captives who bribed guards or passed notes through sympathetic clergy. These messages, though dangerous, traveled faster and with more truth than official channels. When such letters resurface decades later, they reveal not only the suffering of captivity, but also the fierce determination to remain connected. Even under chains and barbed wire, words sought to escape, proving that the human spirit is never fully imprisoned. Neutral nations played a quiet but crucial role in wartime correspondence. Countries like Switzerland, Sweden, and Portugal became intermediaries, rerouting letters between families torn apart by enemy lines. Their post offices and Red Cross branches functioned as arteries of humanity amid a fractured world. In Geneva, clerks worked tirelessly to process mountains of correspondence, carefully verifying addresses, censoring sensitive content, and forwarding messages to destinations across Europe. These workers, often forgotten in history, handled millions of fragile envelopes that carried hope as their only cargo. Some letters passed through several borders, delayed by weeks or months, yet eventually reached their recipients. A mother in Warsaw might learn her son was alive in a British camp only because a neutral intermediary had rerouted his note across half a continent. For those waiting, even a delayed letter was a miracle. Archives from Stockholm reveal packages of correspondence stored in safe houses when delivery was too dangerous. After the war, many of these were handed back to survivors or families, each envelope carrying both joy and sorrow. Joy that words had been preserved, sorrow that time had passed too long to act on them. Neutral nations never fired weapons in the conflict, but they preserved voices that otherwise would have been silenced. Their role in carrying letters across impossible distances shows that in war, even small states could safeguard the fragile threads of human connection. In attics, barns, and forgotten drawers, Bundles of wartime letters have been discovered long after the guns fell silent. Sometimes tied with faded ribbon, sometimes packed in military-issue envelopes. These collections remained hidden for decades, until chance revealed them. Their rediscovery transformed not only family histories, but also the broader memory of war. One such find occurred in France, when a family renovating their farmhouse uncovered a metal box beneath the floorboards. Inside were dozens of letters from Allied soldiers billeted in the region, messages never posted, left behind in the chaos of retreat. Each letter carried not just words, but the atmosphere of that fleeting time, ink smudged by candlelight, affectionate jokes, and hurried lines about movements the writers could not openly describe. In America, postal depots occasionally turned up sacks of undelivered mail, sealed and forgotten in warehouses. When opened years later, they revealed intimate confessions, last farewells, and promises written in youth. Families who received them long after the war often described the experience as both miraculous and cruel, hearing the voices of loved ones preserved in paper, yet knowing they had spoken from another lifetime. Archivists treat these rediscovered letters as artifacts, preserving not just the words but the paper, stamps, and even the smell of ink. Each element becomes part of the testimony, reminding us that history is not only in books or official documents, but also in fragile personal traces. Every rediscovery becomes a second delivery, decades late, but still powerful. These letters extend the war into the present, making us realize that battles never fully end until the words of those who fought and waited have been heard. For the families who eventually received delayed or lost letters, the impact could be transformative. A widow reading her husband's words decades later felt not only grief renewed, but also companionship restored. Children, grown into adults, encountered the voices of parents they barely remembered. The effect was often like reopening a door to the past that had never truly closed. There are testimonies of daughters who, upon receiving their father's letters, finally understood the sacrifices made before they were born. Others discovered unknown details about battles, movements, or feelings that had never been spoken aloud. These letters became pieces of identity, filling gaps in family memory. In some cases, the words even altered relationships across generations. Families reconciled old tensions when letters revealed kindness, apologies, or tenderness hidden by wartime censorship. What had once been silence turned into dialogue, decades after the last line was written. Museums and historical societies frequently receive such discoveries from families who no longer wish to keep them hidden. Exhibited under glass, the letters carry not only personal meaning but collective weight, allowing strangers to share in the intimacy of private words, once intended for only one pair of eyes. For these families, ink became inheritance. The delayed letters taught them that even when war takes lives, it cannot erase voices. On paper, those voices still speak, still shape identities, still connect past to present. Every letter in wartime passed through unseen hands. Military censors opened envelopes, read lines, and cut or blacked out anything considered dangerous. Soldiers learned to write around this invisible presence, shaping their words carefully so they would not be delayed or destroyed. Censors worked in shifts, often reading hundreds of letters in a single day. They were instructed to look for mention of troop movements, casualty numbers, or morale issues. Yet in practice, their pens cut across moments of tenderness, trimming away phrases that revealed more heart than strategy. Families sometimes received pages full of holes, their intimacy replaced by silence. Some censors later admitted the work weighed on them. They read confessions of fear, declarations of love, even announcements of births or deaths, personal stories they were forbidden to acknowledge. For many, the task became haunting, as if they were secret participants in the lives of strangers. The censorship also created unintended codes. Soldiers developed ways of slipping meaning past the black ink, using subtle word choices or deliberately misspelled names to reassure families. Wives and mothers became experts at deciphering these hidden signals, finding comfort in what escaped the censor's blade. Decades later, when uncut drafts are compared with censored versions, the contrast is striking. The missing words remind us that wartime letters were not just shaped by the people who wrote them, but also by those who decided what could be read. Every crossed-out line is a scar left by the machinery of war on the intimacy of communication. Across the world, institutions have taken on the role of guardians for these fragile remnants of war. National archives, local museums, and even small-town historical societies preserve letters donated by families who no longer wish them to remain private. Behind glass or stored in climate-controlled rooms, these documents speak louder than monuments. In Britain, the Imperial War Museum holds vast collections of correspondence from the front lines. Some are displayed to the public, while others remain in restricted collections, accessible only to researchers. Each envelope is catalogued, its date and location recorded, turning personal memory into shared history. In the United States, the Library of Congress has digitized thousands of wartime letters. Online, anyone can read a soldier's note written in a foxhole or a nurse's message scribbled during a night shift. The act of preservation transforms once private words into testimonies available to generations who never knew the writers. These archives also challenge the fragility of memory. Families may forget, but institutions ensure that voices are not silenced by time. For students and historians, reading a simple, "I miss you," written 80 years ago, conveys more truth than any textbook. Letters preserved in archives remind us that war is not just about strategy or politics. It is about individuals speaking across distance, often unsure if their words would ever arrive. By keeping these voices alive, archives ensure that history remains human, intimate, and real. Not all letters ever left the battlefield. Soldiers carried them tucked in breast pockets, inside helmets, or hidden in rucksacks, waiting for the right chance to hand them over to military post offices. But war rarely respected plans. When men fell, their final messages often fell with them, absorbed by the mud or scattered in ruins. Recovery units sometimes found these letters while collecting the dead. Officers did their best to deliver them, but many were too damaged, stained beyond recognition, or stripped of return addresses. Families at home remained unaware that their loved ones had written in their final hours, words trapped in a limbo between intention and delivery. Decades later, metal detectors and archaeological digs across old battlefields have uncovered these remnants. In Normandy, fragments of letters have been unearthed in foxholes, the ink blurred but still legible in parts. Simple greetings, names of children, prayers scribbled quickly before an assault. Each discovery reopens wounds, but also gives voice to the silence. Some battlefield letters became treasures for local civilians. Farmers in Belgium or France, finding them after the fighting, often kept them safe, waiting for a time when they could be returned. Sometimes, that return came 70 or 80 years later, in ceremonies where descendants finally heard words meant for another time. These forgotten letters reveal how communication was as fragile as life itself. Carried close to the heart, they sometimes died with their writers, waiting decades for discovery and delivery. Their survival is less about paper and ink than about the determination of memory to surface against all odds. Beyond the paper, beyond the stamps and envelopes, The endurance of wartime letters lies in the emotions they carried. Love, fear, longing, and faith traveled further than the ink, remaining alive even when the physical letters were lost. Families often repeated the words aloud so many times that they became oral legacies. Children of soldiers memorized their fathers' phrases, quoting them like blessings. Widows kept sentences etched in memory long after the fragile paper disintegrated. Even when the letters themselves were gone, their contents shaped identities, influenced choices, and carried forward across generations. Historians note that the cultural weight of these letters rivals official records. While governments recorded battles and treaties, families preserved tenderness, hope, and humanity. That dual memory, official and personal, creates the fullest picture of the Second World War. Today, projects in schools and communities invite descendants to share wartime letters aloud. The spoken words allow audiences to feel the rhythm, tone, and intimacy of the writers, bridging time in a way silent reading cannot. The letters thus live on, not as fragile paper, but as living voices. What never fades is not the ink itself, but the truth behind it. In the darkest years of the 20th century, ordinary men and women trusted words to travel across oceans and battlefields. Even when they never arrived, the act of writing was itself resistance against silence. The story of wartime letters is not only about ink and paper, it is about the resilience of human connection in the face of unimaginable chaos. Each letter carried across oceans or hidden in coat pockets was an act of defiance against fear and destruction. Even when they never reached their destinations, the very act of writing meant that love, hope, and memory had been declared. These messages, found decades later in attics, archives, shipwrecks, or battlefields, remind us that history is not only told by generals or governments, it is also written in the trembling hand of a young soldier, in the careful words of a mother, in the hurried scrawl of someone who did not know if they would see tomorrow. In those lines, fragile yet enduring, lies the most human record of war. The rediscovery of such letters does more than connect us to the past. It transforms our understanding of resilience. Families who open envelopes long sealed are not only reading old words, they are hearing voices that continue to echo across time, reminding us that even in the darkest hours, the need to be remembered and to love never dies. If these stories moved you, help us keep those voices alive. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have written if you were far from home in a world at war? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, so together, we can continue uncovering the hidden human stories that history books often leave behind.